Today we're going to look at some really old underground trains. Ah no, older than that. Older than that even. No wait, that's too old. Forward a bit. That's it. At the head of this train is one of the Metropolitan Railway's A-Class, the first locomotives built especially for an underground railway. Well, sort of, it's complicated. So, as you might already know, the first ever underground line was the Metropolitan Railway, which opened in 1863 and originally ran from Paddington to Farringdon. At first, the Metropolitan Railway had no trains of its own, but rather was operated by the Great Western Railway, who connected with it at Paddington. The Great Western actually supplied the line with purpose-built locomotives known as the Metropolitan tanks, which I guess technically makes those the first locomotives built especially for an underground railway, but quiet you. The thing is, quite early on, things fell apart between the Great Western and the Metropolitan Railways. There were arguments about frequency of services, about safety, and about, of course, money. Basically, the Great Western didn't want to contribute any money towards extending the Metropolitan unless they also got part ownership. Which leads me to wonder if their long-term plan was to take over. Anyway, the long and short of it was that the Great Western flounced out, taking their trains with them. The Great Northern Railway, who also used the Metropolitan tracks, quickly stepped in with some locomotives that had been hastily adapted for tunnel running. These did not work very well, with one actually exploding at Paddington, and the Metropolitan Railway had obviously realised the pitfalls of relying on another company. So they decided to obtain their own. Now, larger companies would typically build locomotives in-house, but the Met didn't have that facility. So instead, they ordered locomotives from Bayer Peacock of Manchester. John Fowler, the company's chief engineer, oversaw the design. At this point I should mention that there's some debate over who actually designed the locomotives. The design is often attributed to Fowler, but they were adapted from a class that Bayer Peacock had already manufactured for the Tudela to Bilbao railway. This is one of the Spanish engines, and here, for comparison, is the locomotive the Metropolitan got in 1864. I'm inclined to say that they're Bayer Peacock engines with Fowler input. The Metropolitan was a demanding line. The locomotives had to be capable of accelerating and stopping quickly and frequently. They also had to be able to handle tight curves. And, most problematic of all, they had to be able to run through tunnels for long distances. The first locomotives would become known as the A-Class. The Metropolitan lettered its locomotive classes, and indeed the tradition continues all the way to the present, with the current trains on the line being known as S-Stock. The A-Class were 440 tank engines. This wheel arrangement was common on passenger locomotives and was well suited to tight curves. So far, so conventional. Now we need to consider the ways that these were designed for the Metropolitan in particular. Obviously, they have no cabs, only spectacle plates. The Met at this time was almost completely underground. That being said, locomotives of this era commonly didn't have cabs anyway. I'm also going to say that the cab doors look a lot narrower than any others I've seen. But the most obvious adaptation is the condensers, these pipes from the cylinders to the tanks. A steam engine typically discharges a lot of steam, and obviously that's not ideal in a tunnel. The condensers were designed to collect the majority of that steam, condense it, and discharge the water back into the tanks. The locomotives burned coke initially, later switching to Welsh coal. These are both relatively smokeless forms of fuel. Relatively. The fireman was also forbidden from stoking the fire unless the locomotive was in a station where there were ventilation shafts. In the early days, the engines were painted olive green, later being repainted in the deep crimson colour that's perhaps more familiar. They were given classically inspired names. Number 1 was Jupiter, number 2 was Mars, and so on. There were 18 in the first batch, the last being named Hercules. Further batches would be delivered from 1866 to 1869, with the final number standing at 39. The 1868 and 1869 batches had a higher boiler pressure. The engines were modified throughout their working lives. The names didn't last long, only being given to the first batch and removed at overhaul. In the 1880s they were reboilered, and the wheels and cylinders were also increased in size. All of these changes making for faster and more powerful engines. From 1895 they were fitted with cabs, which were rather unpopular with drivers in the tunnels. More locomotives were required in 1879, which were fitted with radial axles and a shorter wheelbase to make them even better at dealing with curves. Put simply, they were improved based on experience. The locomotives that arrived after 1879 would be known as the B class. These engines were far from perfect. I should once again emphasise that no one had ever built a railway like this before, so there were inevitably going to be teething troubles. Even with the measures to reduce smoke and steam, the atmosphere in the tunnels was pretty Stygian, with early accounts stating that you often couldn't see a train coming along the opposite line until it passed you. Nor was it very pleasant for the passengers, although at least one tame doctor claimed on the Met's behalf that the smoke was actually beneficial for bronchial complaints. Other quacks sold a patent medicine known as Metropolitan mixture as a remedy for the effects of smoke inhalation. It was a different time. The condensers were also a problem. They worked, but the issue was that the overall temperature of the recirculated water became warmer and warmer. The injector, the device that pumps water from the tanks into the boiler, relies on difference in temperature to function. As the water heats up, so the injector becomes less efficient, and the one thing you absolutely do not want under any circumstances is an injector that doesn't work. The engines would have to be paused every so often to have their tanks refilled with cold water. The constant stopping and starting caused metal fatigue in the coupling rods, leading to breakages. This was partially resolved by fitting thicker coupling rods, and fully resolved by replacing the valve gear between 1893 and 1896. Despite the engine's shortcomings, they were evidently enough of a success to interest other railway companies. Similar engines were ordered by the Midland Railway, the London and South Western Railway, and the London and North Western Railway. That being said, Francis Webb, Chief Mechanical Engineer of the London and North Western Railway, was not a huge fan of the locomotives and had them rebuilt like this and like this. The Metropolitan's rivals, the District Railway, also bought their own. No surprise, given that the requirements were basically identical. In fact, they used much of the same track, which will become important shortly. William Adams designed a series of suburban passenger locomotives for the North London Railway, which it's hard not to see as influenced by the A-class. Adams would later design the 415 class tank engines for the London and South Western, which again, I have to say, look like a descendant. The Met tanks were long-lasting too. Unfortunately, they were overtaken by technology. By the beginning of the 20th century, there were 3 electrically powered underground railways in London and an ever-increasing number of electric tramways. Electrification on the smoky old Metropolitan and District was inevitable, with the now legendary Charles Yerkes taking the reins on the project. Electrification didn't cover the whole Metropolitan. In fact, it wouldn't until 1961, 28 years after the company had ceased to exist. But by the early 20th century there were new, more modern engines to cover the long-distance, unelectrified services. So the A-class found themselves taken off the front line from 1905 onwards. Some were scrapped. Some were transferred to departmental service and shunting. Some would enjoy a second life, sold off to minor railways. A few were sold to the Cambrian railways, where 2 were converted into tender engines. 2 went to the Mersey Railway, another urban commuter line with underground running. And 2, numbers 41 and 23, were exiled to the Brill branch, one of the Met's outermost reaches. There they would shuttle back and forth with a single coach or a few wagons, a far cry from the intensive inner-city service for which they were built. The final end came in 1935. In 1933, the Metropolitan was taken over by London Transport, who seemed to find the Brill branch a bit of an embarrassment. So, 2 years later, the line was closed. Number 41 was scrapped. But for number 23, there would be a reprieve. It went to Neasden, where it lived out its last 13 years as a shunter, finally being withdrawn in 1948. By this time, it was 82 years old and recognised as a pioneer. It was retired to the Clapham Transport Museum, then to the London Transport Museum, in between finding time to participate in the 1963 centenary of the London Underground. Those frantic early days are far behind it. Now, it serves as a reminder of how far the Underground has come. Well, I hope you enjoyed this steamy tale from the tube. If you did, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I would like to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon for your support. You are the Welsh coal to my firebox, and I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.